increase investment in this agenda. And to begin, or before we begin, I'd like to welcome Jocelyn Ramirez. She is a representative of the Network for Girls Lead and have her tell us what they do. Welcome, Jocelyn. Go ahead, please.
Ahí estamos, ahí te vemos, Jocelyn.
We can see you, Jocelyn. Good afternoon to everyone. As you said, my name is Jocelyn Ramirez. I am 17 years old, and today I am a part of the network entitled Las Niñas Riberan Girls Rule. And we are located in the department of Quetzaltenango in Mexico. But we're not just there, we're in different other municipalities, Cartel and Esperanza. So basically, we are in the western part of Guatemala. So there's a presence of the rural area, and we are very proud because we are a very inclusive community. We have a great deal of diversity, and each member contributes to our effort, including our very valuable adolescent and girl leaders who are often the ones who suffer. We have rich perspectives that strengthen our charismatic network and our mutual support. We see diversity as a source of strength. However, as leaders of the coalition against gender-based violence, are committed to this space because we know and acknowledge that violence is a global problem, not just regional. It affects everyone worldwide. So one thing I'd like to mention is that this is our third consecutive year commemorating the 16 years of activism, 16 days of activism. Now, my role in the network is to be the coordinator for the communication center of Girls Rule. And we realize that through digital tools, we often can have great impact. The information we obtain, we upload to the digital networks because we know that that's where most young people spend their time. They look at Facebook, TikTok, and so it's an excellent tool for information, but it's not just, it does not just stay there. For anybody who does not have that access or don't have a mobile phone or don't have internet, we also replicate the information through our peers in the communities because we believe that more boys, girls, and youth are informed about the topic, the more we can prevent, identify gender-based violence, and therefore try to help stop violence. Something I'd also like to add have been our accomplishments, some of our significant projects we've had in the past 3 years. One of our accomplishments was a story called Health and Your School. It talks about a girl called Lucy who suffers from school bullying, and it shows how she deals with it, how she makes the complaint, and the whole process, which is typical of how a girl experiences this. Then we had in 2022 a campaign, Girls United Against Violence, which was to help prevent and have young people see what networks are available to file complaints. This year we did a fair called Connected and Informed, where we talked about crucial topics such as the violence meter, where you could judge the kind of violence that existed in a relationship. We analyzed it, and that way the girls and boys were able to learn about the different types of violence and how to prevent it. In the 16 days of activism, we also organized a digital campaign to have it go viral online, because as I said earlier, we want these digital platforms to empower uh, us, the young girls, so that their voices are heard. We also have developed strategic partnerships with the media. We collaborate with journalists. One of the journalists is the news broadcasting program that has helped us a lot. And because it broadcasts and reaches a large number of people, they helped us with many activities. For instance, the Equality Forum in New York. And this is a way that our profile is raised and we are better known. So we've had track record where our voices have been heard, and we try to look for different ways of doing this, not just one single place where women can go. We want many different, so that we can become agents of change and continue raising our voice to contribute to a world where women's voices are heard. So this is an example of what we've done so far in this area, and I try to summarize and be brief in what we've done and what we're continuing to do and will continue to develop. Thank you very much. And I'm representing here the network of Las Niñas Líderes. Thank you very much, Jocelyn. What to hear you is very inspiring and energizing, and very interesting to hear what you're doing in Guatemala. I'd like to comment that this program is being transmitted in different languages. And so if you're on Zoom or YouTube, you can select the language you'd like to hear. And if you wish to continue the discussion, remember that the hashtag is 16 days, number 16 days, there's no excuse. So let's move on to the discussion panel, and welcome to our very distinguished panel members. Thank you very much for being with us. They will talk to us about different approaches to prevention and response to gender-based violence, the responses that are being applied in Latin America and the Caribbean, but they're also going to talk about how you can scale up these actions, this work that's being done, and how you can better invest in the agenda. So, having said all this, I'd like to welcome our panelists. I'll begin with Maria Noel Baeza, who's the Regional Director of UN Women for the Americas and the Caribbean, Marilu Valdez, the Deputy Director of the Pan American Health Organization, Maninder Gill, Global Director of the Environmental and Social Framework of the World Bank, Monica Botero, Director of the National Institute of Women in Uruguay, Vania Diana, she is the head of the Office of Violence Against Women in the Ministry of Women in Brazil, Teresa Inchausti Romero, former member of the Mexican Chamber of Deputies, and Jocelyn, who is the representative of Girls Rule. And thank you for supporting us and for those following us in this webinar. So in order to save time, I'd like to share the biographies in the chat of the event so you can check their biographies. And we will now begin with Maria Noel, the Regional Director of UN Women for the Americas and the Caribbean. UN Women is an institution recognized as a worldwide defender of women and girls, and it has played a key role in mobilizing governments and civil society to invest in prevention. So with this, Maria, I'd like to ask you, why do you think this year's theme of the 16 days is so important? Go ahead, please. Thank you very much, Jessica. It's a pleasure to meet you through this means, and a pleasure to be here with all the other participants. I'd like to extend a warm greeting to all the other panel members, and also to our dear Rosalyn Ramirez. It was great to hear you. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's an honor for me to host you in this event together with the Pan American Health Organization, the World Bank, and the United Kingdom. And here I'd like to welcome Marin Hill, Marilu Valdez, and Alice Gelberg, as well as my dear Monica Botero. I'm a Uruguayan and she is too. So she is the head of the Women's Institute. Also, Manilla and Teresa Romero. As you know, for 20 years now, we've had the campaign called Unite. It's a campaign of the Secretary General, and we are a secretariat of that. And it's appeal we make to all governments of the world to strengthen their effort to eradicate gender-based violence against women and girls. It's a campaign that began as an interagency campaign through all UN agencies, and today it's global. We have more than 140 countries that have adopted the campaign, are working on it, and above all, it's a campaign that draws attention in the 16 days from the 25th of November, which is the International Day Against Gender-Based Violence, and the 10th of December, which is the Human Rights Day. And I'd like to add that this year we're celebrating 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So during those 16 days, the campaign is a very strong one and draws attention to this issue. I'd like to tell you what our global report says that we prepared with UNODC. Last year, there were 98,000 deaths, violent deaths by women, 98,000. And of that, 48,000 arose out of an intrafamily relationship. In other words, the woman cannot be comfortable in her own home. Let's not forget also that wars cause a huge number of deaths, but never in the numbers we're talking about, never such violent deaths against women. So unfortunately, that means that the world is at war with women, and we have to draw attention to that topic. We have to draw attention not only to during these 16 days, but every day. And this year, we must invest to prevent violence. And it's crucial to do so this year. Why? Because it's nice to talk, but it's better to do, much better to do. And to do things, we need resources. And what always happens is that campaigns don't have enough resources. They don't have resources to initiate the actions to invest to prevent violence. You'll have to look for resources with a magnifying glass because they can't be found. And to invest to prevent violence requires funding, significant funding, in order to save all those women from these violent deaths, this feminicide. UN Women, PAHO, UN agencies have worked on and adapted to the global framework that is referred to as RESPECT. This is a framework to prevent violence against women in our region and worldwide, and it includes 7 practical strategies to prevent violence against women. This collaboration in this framework has led to having the World Bank be included to support this framework. They've supported several workshops with national authorities, with civil society in several countries in the region. Latin America and the Caribbean is a pioneering region in the fight against gender-based violence. There are 13 countries that have adopted comprehensive laws against women's violence, and 18 countries have ratified the Feminicide edict. But there's still many challenges before us. In 2022, we registered 4,000 femicides in the region, 11 women per hour. And there are more and more factors that lead to this increase in violence, such as human mobility, migration, climate change, organized crime, and technology. The technology has exacerbated violence against girls and women. That's why it's absolutely necessary to implement existing legislation and to adopt public policies. And as I said earlier, we need to have funding. We need to have a specific focus on the importance to get countries to invest in developing strong partnerships with multilateral organizations, with civil society organizations. It's the grassroots women's organizations that know where the problems are located, that know where the women who are suffering violence and need support. The funds allocated for prevention policies and response to violence against women and girls are too low. We reviewed 35 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the amount of allocation is 0.1 and 1% of the national budget. In other words, nothing. You have to look for it with a magnifying glass. That's why we need to increase the funding for these efforts so that governments will increase their investment. The cost of violence between couples represent 0.7% of GDP. In other words, 4 times more that is invested in violence, and they only invest 0.1 or 1% in violence against women. It doesn't make sense. We need to invest in order to decrease the cost of violence. 2030 is around the corner, and we have to be very strong in our efforts, accelerate our efforts to achieve gender equality and elimination of violence. UN Women, the UK government, the Pan American Health Organization, the World Health Organization, and many other organizations, such as the government of Kenya, the government of Uruguay, are in that coalition to prevent violence against gender. The European Union is also involved. This collective action is beginning and has developed a roadmap with indicators on how we should eliminate this violence. During these 16 days, we are now appealing to everyone, to the private sector, to the multilateral organizations, to allocate many more resources to prevent and put an end to violence against women and girls. I hope that this will be a very successful event, and let us continue to demand attention so that we can eliminate gender-based violence and we obtain the resources we need for this. Thank you very much, Jessica, and great success in the event.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. It's a privilege to have you here. There's 98,000 violent deaths. So that is against women last year, and 48,000 happened within the family. And your message was clear: investment, investment, investment. And speaking of investments, who can best speak about investment and financing than the World Bank representative? We have Maninder Gill, who is here representing the World Bank. Welcome, Maninder. I'd like to ask you, what do you think is needed to boost investment in prevention? And could you please give us examples of how this could be done in practice? Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Jessica, for the intro and also the question. And I will talk about increasing investments, but perhaps even more importantly, especially listening to Maria Noel just now and to Jocelyn Ramirez earlier, also the quality and the impact of those investments. So it's not just about resources and money, but it's resources and money well utilized for a strong impact on the ground and changing the lives of women and girls who face violence and gender-based violence on a daily basis. So really honored to be here. It's great to see that we have 320 people now listening in or watching. That's terrific. And it's really a big honor for me to be part of this distinguished panel to commemorate what we do every year, 16 days of activism against GBV. And there isn't a more urgent time than this to be having this discussion, and as was said earlier, to have some action on the ground. So what are we doing in the World Bank? We, starting from very humble beginnings about 7-8 years ago, we have now really ramped up our work on investing in preventing and responding to gender-based violence. Since 2017, we have now 440 investment projects around the World Bank, which is, just to give you a sense, we have a total of about 1,600 projects which are ongoing at any given moment. And even those who are working on this issue, myself, Diana Arango, other colleagues, even we were uh, pleasantly surprised that we have roughly 25% of our projects that actually invest in preventing and responding to gender-based violence. And this is from a base of perhaps maybe 5 or 10 projects 7-8 years ago. So it's a massive increase in the number of projects and increase in the number of resources. So what do we work on? Given that we are the World Bank, we deal with governments, we lend to governments and work with them. So we have invested a lot in strengthening national systems for prevention of gender-based violence and for ensuring quality services for potential survivors. So that's one advantage we have, is that we can help take things to scale. So if there is innovation and promising results and impacts, we can then take them to scale by helping adopt them at the national level and even beyond countries where they may have taken place. The second aspect that we work on is women's economic empowerment. Unless you level the playing field, unless the power differential is reduced, you cannot eradicate gender-based violence. So we do work a lot on women's economic empowerment. And one could say this is a bit indirect. This is not directly confronting GBV, but it is still a very powerful tool, because economic empowerment reduces the power differential, addresses it, and really makes women. And we have some very inspiring examples where very young people sorry.
You're
I'm okay
muted.
now. I'm okay now.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I was saying that we have many examples where young women, just like Jocelyn Ramirez, have not only addressed GBV within their own communities, but have become leaders in remote communities, rural communities, of addressing gender-based violence, and sometimes even becoming broader leaders, going to other agendas as well, and at a very young age. So there are some very inspiring examples that are coming out of this work of promoting women's economic empowerment. We also working with communities to change behaviors, which is the most essential, but the trickiest. That's something where it'll be great to gather more examples. What is it that that promotes behavior change? What is it that signals to a society, to a community, to young boys and men, that it's not acceptable, not okay to engage in GBV, gender-based violence kind of behavior? So I think those kinds we do invest in those. It's not an easy field. It's easier said than done. It's easy to provide inputs rather than have serious outcomes. But that's an area of investment and experimentation that we have. And also, we invest a lot in safe public spaces. And there's a lot of evidence where just having well-lit roads and parks help minimize, reduce, or safe buses, safe transport. We do make a lot of investments in that. And many of it's become routine now. Urban development projects or transport projects routinely now address issues of promoting safety in public spaces. So all of this work is ongoing, and we would look for opportunities to give more examples to kind of double click and provide you more of a real life insight into what kind of things we are doing. But just to give you a few examples, we have a project in Brazil. It's an education project which specifically targets survivors of gender-based violence who may have dropped out because of stigma or because of early teenage pregnancy. It specifically seeks them out and brings them back into the education process. So it's rather than just opening a school and saying, anyone is welcome, it actually targets them and persuades them in giving them agency in a survivor-centric manner. There is a project in Honduras where, as part of disaster risk management, when the risk of GBV could go much higher because there is overall lack of public order, so it helps establish protocols to prevent and respond to GBV against children and violence against children. And what is counterintuitive, one would imagine that you are fighting a cyclone or a hurricane or something else to tsunami, but within that embedding the notion of addressing gender-based violence. And then a lot of work with our private sector, the International Finance Corporation, working with companies, for example, in Mexico, and Jocelyn may have seen some examples of that. We are promoting codes of conduct among staff, disseminating it, have company leadership play a very important championing role in sending the message that GBV will not be tolerated. So that kind of work is also what we are doing. Now, I have 5 kind of final takeaways or things that I think we need to do more of. One, we need to have more impact evaluations, because there's a lot we can do in terms of inputs and investments, but it is very important for a decision maker to be convinced that this works and that resources are scarce, that they're not spending resources on something which has questionable impact. And usually the resort is, let's strengthen police, let's strengthen law enforcement, which doesn't really help in prevention. Partly it does, but then more impact evaluations. Second is partnerships. I think that came out very loud and clear. This is something which the World Bank, working with governments, absolutely cannot do alone. It has to be CSOs, NGOs, community organizations, young people who are leaders of today and tomorrow themselves. Need to be partnerships which are aimed at working on the ground. We have many partnerships which are more macro, more meetings, more discussions, which are also very essential. But partnerships that have a direct impact and interface on the ground among communities and how we partner on the ground is really important. Related to that is communities are very important partners. And Jocelyn mentioned using Facebook, TikTok. It is important to know what is it that moves people to change behaviors today. I'm from a generation where we produced reports and we thought that people would read reports and then things will happen. Today's world doesn't seem to be like that. So we need to tap into what are the primers of behavior change. How can communities play an important role? Is there a role for famous singers, famous players to be signaling to young men it's not cool to be violent? If you are a man, the last and the worst thing you can do is to engage in gender-based violence. Would that help? So I think those are the kind of things which should be mined with the help of communities. We do have in the World Bank, you would be pleased to know, every single project does a risk assessment of gender-based violence, whether it's involving contractors, civil works, or a health and education project. And we have a requirement that you need to put in place measures to make sure that our project does not in any way contribute to GBV. For example, workers having, sexually abusing local community members, or teachers abusing children, students. So we have those requirements. That's been a great entry point for investing in prevention. Once we have 20 projects that require this in a country, then a country says, can we do something at a more macro scale, please? Because this is clearly very important. So let's see how we can invest in bigger systems on prevention. So that's something we need to do more of. And then finally, I would say that I started with the more impact evaluations, disseminating this research to decision makers, whether it's mayors or ministers or key officials. Sometimes this research remains within us. People on this call are aware, but many of us are not decision makers on the ground. So how is it that we package these findings and have this disseminated to decision makers so that they keep those in mind as they make the decisions about what to invest in on the ground? So let me pause here. And once again, very grateful to be here and looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks, Jessica. Back to you.
Con gusto, Maninder. Muchas gracias por estas palabras. Y qué
A
importante.
pleasure, Mandy, and thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so much
those
for your
words and how
remarks and what you
important
said about
it
the
is
work
to-
the World Bank has been doing in violence prevention is very important. It's also interesting to hear about the projects in Brazil, Mexico, Honduras. So thank you very much. And we're going to move on with our slogan, Invest to Prevent. That is the message for this year. But where are we investing exactly? And this ties in with what Manager was saying. I would now like to go to the Pan American Health Organization, the World Health Organization, which is known for its work with an evidence-based approach. We're going to call on Mariluz Valdez, who's Deputy Director of the Pan American Health Organization. Welcome again. I'd like to ask you, what should we be investing in?
Jessica, thank you. And let me say, PAHO is incredibly proud to be a co-sponsor of this event that's commemorating the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. I personally feel very privileged to join such an esteemed panel, and it's always difficult to follow such leaders as Maria Noel and Manader. We must invest in evidence-based interventions that have proven to work to prevent violence against women and girls, and that are already well reflected in what we call the RESPECT framework. Maria Noel mentioned this. The sheer number of women and girls that are impacted by violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, an estimated 1 in 3 women, is particularly, I don't have another word, but shocking, because we know that violence is preventable. Working together, we can prevent violence and mitigate its consequences for women and girls, their families, and their communities, so that everyone, everywhere, can live healthy lives free from violence. Now, PAHO, in terms of investments, PAHO is one of the co-leaders of the work on RESPECT, which is a multi-agency framework developed by the World Health Organization, UN Women, and other partners globally. PAHO and UN Women have adapted RESPECT for the Latin America and the Caribbean region, sub-region. Again, RESPECT consists of 7 strategies for preventing violence against women and girls, and each letter of RESPECT stands for one of the strategies. And it is based on the best available evidence and with the greatest potential of preventing violence. RESPECT offers a roadmap for everyone, regardless of the agency, the sector, or institution we may belong. From interventions that promote shared decision-making between partners in their home, to microfinance and cash transfer programs, to improvements in infrastructure and transport systems that promote safety, to school-based programs that teach necessary life skills to girls and boys, and to actions to strengthen access to quality health services for the survivors of violence. RESPECT is a tool that helps us fine-tune approaches to maximize our reach and impact of our efforts of the investments being made. Now, in a world bombarded by fake news, anecdotal information, and new hypes constantly, it is essential that we consistently ask ourselves, what are the strategies that we know actually work? And what are the interventions where evidence actually exists toward positive impacts? We must resist the temptation to select interventions simply because we're actually used to implementing them, or because they sound kind of interesting. As the speakers before me have said, when faced with limited resources, we must invest only in what we know can make a real difference. And this is the provision of RESPECT. And it is also core to a public health approach to violence. Investing in evidence-based approaches is so important because we have a joint and shared responsibility to avoid harm associated with implementing actions that are not supported by evidence. And it is also our responsibility to maximize investments and interventions that truly have a value and are sustainable, especially to the women and girls that have been left behind for far too long. Together with UN Women, PAHO has had the privilege to launch a new report, the first of its kind, on good practices from Latin America and the Caribbean in line with respect. And this report includes examples of Brazil, Ecuador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Peru, and others. It highlights our region's contributions on what works to prevent violence against women and girls. There is so much we already know, but there's also so much that we can learn from each other. To make this vision a reality on the ground, PAHO, UN Women, and the World Bank collaborated last year, or in this past year, on the development of training materials for both policymakers and program managers. And we worked with the governments of Bolivia and Chile to convene multiple sectors and partners and promote dialogue on what actually works to prevent violence against women and girls. So I'll end by saying, colleagues, the challenges we face in eliminating violence requires action across all sectors, across all stakeholders, and across all countries. We each have a role to play, and together we can raise our voices and make a difference for women and girls everywhere. Jessica, thank you again, and I'll turn it over to you.
Muchas gracias, Marilu, y muy interesante
Thank
todo.
you very, very much, Mary Lou. Very interesting what you've said, and one sentence has stuck. Violence is preventable. That's extremely important. Now, let me move to Uruguay, and they will talk to us more about Generation Equality, which is a world initiative to pushes for investment in gender equality. It involves the UN Women, the World Health Organization, and the UK. Together with Uruguay, they have a leadership position in this coalition against gender-based violence. For this, Mónica Botero, the director of the National Women's Institute of Uruguay, will be speaking. Welcome, Mónica. And let me ask you, what is the importance of the work for Uruguay, and how have you advanced this initiative at the home level? Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and greetings to all the other panelists, and to my dear Maria Noel Baeza, since she's a fellow citizen. Thank you for having invited me to participate. Uruguay is honored to have been chosen as the country to represent Latin America in the Coalition for Action. The coalition is a response to gender-based violence, and it's part of a UN project to do this. It includes Kenya, Iceland, and Great Britain. We have, as a result, taken on certain commitments with the understanding that our good practices of the projects we have implemented will be used by other countries as a guide for their work. And what we have proposed in this joint effort at the coalition is to develop good practices as well as projects and proposals that could be implemented or could serve as a North Star for implementation by future governments. The coalition had great difficulty in being implemented just a few weeks before the pandemic started. So as a result, we had to confront that challenge, and we had to deal with the governments that took over in the second half of the implementation of the program, and that has led to some difficulties in implementation. But it doesn't mean that we have not assumed the commitment and been accountable for what we have taken on. For those of you participating at this meeting, who are not necessarily specialists in this topic, let me make an opening comment, which is that in order to be able to analyze this issue, we have to understand that gender-based violence is not going to be overcome until the inequality of women is overcome, with all their intersectional nature of the inequality. In other words, as long as gender inequality exists, there will be violence due precisely to that inequality and the violence generated by inequality. So that's our point of departure. That's our initial premise. And very often when we talk about responding to gender-based violence or prevention or big projects, we're often talking about responses when the most extreme form of inequality exists, which is gender-based violence, already exists, has already occurred. That's why it's so important to begin with the premise that this inequality is what is leading to gender-based violence. And as a result, we have to think of policies and responses that don't just address gender-based violence as a target, but addresses inequality. And the first inequality is economic inequality. What does this mean? Difficult to economic success by women because of the very condition that they are women. So in having to deal with this huge challenge, which is to provide economic autonomy, the person who ends up suffering from physical economy or political economy is interlinked, because a woman without economic autonomy is going to have much more difficulty to confront violence or deal with the violence or implement prevention measures, because her economic condition and actually also her cultural condition will be affecting the response to violence. Recently, I talked about political autonomy. The very fact that more women are chosen for decision-making positions in government and private enterprise, again, is closely linked to the opportunity to obtain investment and have an impact on the national budgets and to have an impact on the implementation of policies for this purpose. Why? Because the more women are committed to the gender agenda in decision-making bodies means there will be more prioritization of the agenda and therefore the budget and any decision that deals with violence. So to overcome inequality overall and to take into account the economic universe and political universe means that there will be greater opportunity for women to be in decision-making positions that are committed to the agenda. Because sometimes you may have women, but they may not be committed to the gender-based agenda. It's crucial to have that to bring about real change in the response to gender-based violence. So for us in Uruguay, but it's also what the Coalition for Action considers crucial, it's very important to have interinstitutional work. In other words, the response to prevention and to repairing gender-based violence and to obtaining the investments required and to ensure that budgets are allocated for that purpose is not just the mechanism of the gender-based mechanisms or the ministries or secretariat. It is the responsibility of the entire state. And that is included in our comprehensive law. We are one of the few countries that does have a comprehensive law. And in that law, it states that the responsibility is the responsibility of the state. In other words, the Ministry of Housing is responsible. The Ministry of Education also has responsibility to prevent. The ministries of health have a huge responsibility in preventing, both in detecting the problem as well as in providing a response and providing support to the women and girls and boys also who are the aggressors, or men who are the aggressors, to provide a response in the area of mental health. Let me give you an example that shows things very clearly. Say a boy or a girl comes to a hospital with a bone break, or a serious injury. If there is a staff member that has been trained and is on the lookout for this issue, they will try to find out what is the origin for the bone break, and will activate a protocol within all the responsible organizations to ensure that they are accountable. But if the staff is not aware of the issue, of the problem, they have no guidance, they will put, will just put a cast on the child and send him home. That's the difference between interinstitutional work, where all areas, not just the gender-based mechanisms, but all of them get involved in the topic. And they don't think that it's just the job of the Ministry of Women or the gender-based violence mechanism. It's a much broader problem. That's why I say investment is politically not attractive, but it means having workshops and courses which we know will deeply affect public policy response, but often doesn't provide policy response. So it's a major undertaking to have interinstitutionality operate. And also it means that we have to be committed to our citizens. If the citizens are not aware of the problem, are not conscious of it, and are not taking ownership and responsibility to involve everyone in their community, in their family, and in all those people that surround them, to find out what should be the minimal response. In our case, it's a phone. 80800-4141 is a national response, a telephone line you can call, and there will be a specialist that will not only listen to your case, but will tell you what needs to be done. Should you contact the police or a health center or one of our technical experts at the National Women's Institute? But the citizens have to be aware of this. They know about it, because we can be offering resources, but we can't go into every single home, every case, every square to find out exactly what is happening with people who may have a need. So you have to train the staff. There has to be interinstitutionality. There has been mass awareness campaigns with the population. And we have two other good practices that I'd like to share with you briefly. One is the campaign of violence-free engagements, and we've been implemented in our country. And in a country of 3 million inhabitants, we've had about 100,000 students of junior high and high school who have participated in this campaign for over 50 days with their teachers, talking about and thinking about the topic. And we have seen the development of artistic products or training products for those who come behind, by establishing links about respect and equality. The other is a project in the digital arena. We think that in order to develop responses and disseminate information about it and create awareness, and to also develop a police and legal response to gender-based violence cases in the digital arena, is through these networks. and that affect the youngest people, that reach the youngest people. That could be a very important tool for the prevention of gender-based violence. Uruguay has undertaken more than 20 actions under this Coalition for Action. And since I don't have much time, I've only mentioned a couple, but we are here ready to work with the organizations of civil society, gender-based mechanisms, and other countries in the region who may be interested in discussing these topics further. Thank you very much, and my apologies if I exceeded the time frame.
No problem. That was very interesting, Monica. I was especially struck by what you said, that it's not only to focus on gender-based violence, but also inequality in general. Now let's leave Uruguay and go to Brazil. We know that in Brazil, the women's rights movement is nothing new. It's the country that enacted the Maria La Peña law, banning 5 types of violence. And early this year, Brazil announced a series of measures to enhance prevention of violence against women and improve women's equality. We have Vania Viana, who is the head of the office that deals with violence against women in the Ministry of Women. So we'd like to ask you, what are the main investment areas to enhance prevention efforts, and how do you make sure that these measures benefit all women and girls in Brazil in all different categories? Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to greet all of you, all the organizations that are sponsoring this activity, and also all the presenters. First of all, I am representing our secretary, who is currently attending another event. And I wanted to speak about the situation in Brazil. For us, activities started back in November, and we know that their rates of violence are higher among the Black communities in our country. So in November, we began working in addressing violence. For us here in Brazil, well, we have been working in this area. And when we talk about policies, we have to look at what we've gone through in recent years. We had a different government, and that led to a period where Jair Bolsonaro was elected in 2018. And during that period, we did see a rise in violence against women. And there was a decrease in investments as a result of the policies in place. And there were changes in policies that had been established by more democratic governments in 2013. That is why we saw a change in the situation. And there were a number of consequences that had an impact on the population, especially those that were victims of misogynist behavior. After that period, we were able to see a change once the Lula administration took office, and we are returning to our previous policies, reinstating them. So we are currently in a restructuring phase. We were also affected by the pandemic, like others, and this gave rise to an increase in violence, especially health workers, in addition to workers in other categories. But women on the front lines were affected. So this led to a situation in Brazil. And what I would say is our great achievement is that we have a Ministry of Women's Affairs that is very important because President Lula believes in the rights of women. And we are now working to shore up the ministry, to reinstate policies. We're going back to the previous policies and considering women as part of a public and democratic movement. We are putting in place a series of policies, not just going back to old policies, but also introducing new policies. So now we have specialists who are supporting our efforts and also are representing the ministry. On the 14th, we are inaugurating a facility in Salvador, and we're working with the large Black population in that community. And there's also going to be a meeting in Ceará. 19 centers who work with women, and these are funded from our own budget. We'll be working in partnership with the Ministry of Justice in the area of reducing violence against women. We're also going to have a partnership with Itaipu in the area of prevention. Our Minister Gonçalves, is going to be hosting a meeting in Mato Grosso do Sul. Que também são centros de acolhimento, de atendimento à violência física, psicológica, sexual. So we're going to be addressing physical, psychological, sexual violence, all types of violence against women. We want them to be recognized as such. And in addition to that, we are setting up an important policy in the ministry. We are signing on to a specific policy under the human rights agenda that will address the situation of women. We will be restructuring this policy and making adjustments to the corresponding protocols. To ensure that women have access to tools that will enable them to participate fully in decision-making. So these are part of what we are doing. There's a national pact that involves all the ministries in Brazil. which is essential to ensure that we do have an effective prevention policy in place. There's also an initiative to fight misogyny. This is an initiative which involving communities to address what has been cultural violence against women. We believe this is one of the main causes of violence, and unfortunately, the numbers confirm this in Brazil. To conclude, we wanted to mention that we have established reference centers in different units, and we are working with the civil society organizations. We're also going to be working with a ministerial group and a working group, an interministerial group that will undertake changes at the federal level. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate at this forum. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for giving us an overview of the situation in Brazil, especially given that you are in a reconstruction phase and you have described the work being done by the Ministry of Women's Affairs. Violence against women is a matter for ministries of women's affairs, but it also involves other high-level authorities and partners required to undertake collective action. We have Teresa Inchausti de Romero, who is an expert with the Mexican government. She was recently elected vice president of the CEVI. Welcome, Teresa. I'd like to ask you, why is the prevention of violence against women, why is it a matter for all these other sectors as well? Thank you. I would like to turn on my camera. Can you see me? Yes, your camera is off. Now we can see you. Thank you, Jessica, and let me start by thanking everyone for this invitation to be here today. What I'd like to say is that preventing and eradicating are the missing links in the value chain of policies to prevent, respond to, and eradicate violence, gender-based violence. These are the two areas we have not been able to connect properly. And I would agree with what our colleague Botero was saying about this. What's important is for us to fully consider the status of women in our societies. When we look at the legislation enacted over the past 30 years in the region, when we read the reports, when we look at the indicators published by states on the MESELVI platform, reflecting their compliance with commitments, we see that the laws are there, they're in place, but that they have not put an end to violence. As our colleague Botero said, there are resources supporting the various mechanisms at different levels. And we see an increasing number and diversity of mechanisms as we see violence evolve as well. First, we started with violence within the family, and now we have some laws that typify 14 different forms of violence. And we're still counting because now we are looking at what is happening on the digital front. And there are other types of violence there as well. So we are seeing a growing number of types of violence, and as a result, the number of laws we have also grows. And what this does, it fragments our approach, our scarce resources are spent on different causes. And I've done some numbers looking at the budget and looking at the number of potential victims based on survey results. And what I see is that there's about 1,000 pesos, which is about $50 spent per every woman who was a potential victim of violence in the year prior to the survey. And that is without factoring in other costs. What this means is that we also need to add institutional violence to the list because we're not providing a proper response. So what I think is that we need to turn things around and we need to start at the end to truly be effective in waging this war. And I'd like to share 4 very simple points. We need to change social norms, but it should not be simply preaching or advocating changes in the way women are treated. We need to truly bring about structural and institutional changes that address women's unequal status. These are points that have been addressed by major authors like Carol Pateman, who said that there is no equality because we have a different status. And that is something that is very clear. And if we look at marriage, collective empowerment is my next point. What we offer victims in this regard are different programs like microcredit programs. We don't have a comprehensive approach. This is done individually. And what we need to do, and this has been shown when we look at best practices, it's more effective to organize women collective movements, to allow them to organize in a way so that they can be more effective in their actions. Also, the other important point is looking at the context in which violence happens. We are working with a standard definition of violence, and we're working with standardized services that do not really take into account where this violence is happening. It doesn't take into account the context. So this is a growing issue we see in countries. The use of weapons in acts of violence is something that is growing. So instead of bringing about changes in male behavior, we're seeing an increase in toxic male behavior, and that is something that also needs to be addressed. And then looking at the budget, I think that we should demand that our governments have platforms where they publish all the resources allocated and that there be more accountability so that we can truly know how much is being spent, how much is being contributed to this cause. And this should include actions to recover spaces. But I'd like to focus on how we need to change norms. When we spoke of violence against women as an issue having to do with power, having to do with inequality, that made it a political conflict. And I do believe that that is what we need to stress. As I see it, it is one of the 21st century's social conflicts. Women have left the homes where they were stuck, where they were locked up, to do what some experts have called to bring about a structural change. I think this opened the door to new types of disputes that also involve distribution. This change in status has meant that women have had to do a much larger share of the work. Sometimes they have to work 2 or 3 different shifts outside the home. So I based my proposal on Carol Pateman's ideas. We need to start by reviewing the marriage contract. We need to change it. We need to define the roles to be played by both individuals when it comes to parenting, when it comes to work in the home, also ownership within the marriage, as well as custody, also rights of children. It is important to have these administered by other institutions. The rights of children, for example, should not be subject to disputes between the parents. The state must have administrative jurisdiction independently of what happens between the child's parents. Also, sexuality and the reproductive rights of women in the marriage, all of that has to be clearly defined as well. And everything having to do with the ownership of property. So we need to do away with that old marriage contract we still have in our countries, and we should replace it with a new contract where we have modernized the relationship between men and women in a marriage.
And I think from the community perspective, because community violence of community femicide is also increasing. So I think there we have to clearly talk about the right to autonomy, to bodily autonomy, and that has to be included in the Constitution as a fundamental right. Also, labor rights. We have to move forward in that. We have to end the sticky floor and the glass ceiling and change this, not change roles, but begin to put this down in writing so that the budget that governs a relationship puts the woman in a different position, gives her a different status, real equality status. That, I think, it would be important to underscore. Thank you very much. Thank you, Teresa. Very interesting, particularly what you were saying about the change of social standards from the perspective of the marriage contract. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. We're coming to the close of this event. For this, we have Alicia Herbert, who's a special envoy of the UK for gender equality. She comes from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. She will talk to us about the role that new stakeholders should have to push forward the agenda on gender-based violence in the region. Alicia, go ahead, please.
Estamos esperando a Alicia que se conecte. Adelante, Alicia.
Alicia, we're waiting for you to connect. Are you on board, Alicia?
Sì, estou aqui. Obrigada. Bom dia e boa tarde a todos. É prazer
Good
estar com vocês
afternoon
hoje para
to
falar sobre
everyone. It's a
assunto tão
pleasure
importante.
to be all
Vou falar
with you
sobre
to
a
speak
experiência
about
do Reino
something so
Unido
important.
e
I will
o que
talk about the
estamos
experience of the
priorizando agora
United
na
Kingdom.
prevenção
I
da
think we're
violência de gênero.
giving priority
Estou
to
falando com
gender-based
vocês da nossa
violence
embaixada
prevention.
em Brasília,
We
então é apropriado
have
fazer
been
minha introdução em
impacted in
português.
Brasilia,
Espero que
and
vocês não se
I hope,
importem
therefore,
que eu
you
faça
will
o restante do meu discurso em inglês.
be
Obrigada.
able to listen to my understand my Portuguese, but now I will switch to English.
Gender-based violence is a global problem, affecting 1 in 3 women globally, including 1 in 4 women in the UK. Some women and girls are more at risk. For example, women living with disabilities, women from minority ethnic groups, or trans women. Violence is being replicated online as well, with data suggesting that 85% of women globally have witnessed or experienced online violence. In Latin America, 11% of women have experienced sexual violence perpetrated by someone other than a partner, almost double the global average of 6%. 10 of the 12 countries with the highest rates of femicide are in Latin America. And child, early, and forced marriage are unions continue to affect 1 in 5 girls in the region. All of this has significant negative consequences for women and girls, their families, and societies. Ending GBV, ending gender-based violence is an urgent and under-resourced issue. But we know that with investment, prevention is possible. Rigorous evaluations conducted across Africa and Asia under the first phase of the United Kingdom's What Works to Prevent Violence program showed reductions in violence of around 50%. So what role can new players have in fostering progress on gender-based violence prevention in Latin America and the Caribbean? So I'll just offer a few suggestions. First, they should support grassroots women's rights activists and movements. We only need to look at the inspirational examples of Neuma Ineos and the Green Wave in Latin America to understand the fundamental importance of this. Women's rights organizations working to prevent and to respond to gender-based violence require direct, flexible core funding, as well as technical assistance to support them to grow and have an impact at scale. The UK is pleased to support organizations working at the grassroots in Latin America and the Caribbean through our funding to the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. Grantees include the Centro Interdisciplinario de Derechos, Infancia y Paternidad, who are working to address violence against women with disabilities in Mexico, and Comunema, working to end violence against Afro-descendant women and girls in Brazil. We're also investing up to £38 million via the Equality Fund to provide core funding to women's rights organizations globally, including in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm delighted to be speaking to you from Brasilia, where the embassy is working with Fala Mulher, which provides shelter, legal advice, and job workshops to survivors and works with thousands of women every year. Second, use evidence and adapt and test successful approaches in the region. The UK is proud to have invested for many years in growing the global evidence base of what works to prevent violence against women and girls. We are now providing around £67 million through phase 2 of our What Works programme to scale up proven approaches and proven models to test innovative new ways of doing things. There's much more still to do, especially in this region, where in 2020, our own research identified only 9 rigorous evaluations of gender-based violence programs in Latin America, compared to 29 in North America and 42 in Sub-Saharan Africa. The UK is beginning to gather evidence on the prevalence and drivers of gender-based violence in Latin America and on effective approaches to tackle GBV in the Caribbean. Working with other development partners, we can help to plug gaps and inform the design of innovative and effective initiatives. Third, we will not address the scale of the problem without working at scale. And we've heard some amazing examples of work across the region to do exactly this. Under the What Works program, for example, we are going beyond projects to work through state systems at national and local levels to scale up proven solutions. For example, we are gauging the education system to introduce consent into school curricula, or tweaking the design of cash transfers to optimize their impact on reducing violence. This can deliver multiple co-benefits, so combination of benefits. For example, there's promising evidence that school-based interventions can be effective in both reducing violence as well as improving learning outcomes, well-being, and attitudes to gender. And finally, addressing gender-based violence isn't just about funding. It's our responsibility to stand up for women's and girls' rights on the international stage and support activists to do the same. Women's and girls' rights are under attack. While opposition has always existed, we are now witnessing far greater, more organized, transnational momentum to finance and accelerate the erosion of these rights. But we are not standing still. For example, in Chile, we are working with civil society to counter online gender-based violence and empower women and girls to assert their right to participate in public life. We are keen to work with governments from across the world, including in this region, to use our collective political influence to protect hard-won gains for women's and girls' rights. So in summary, what would I say to those with the power to invest in gender-based violence prevention? 3 things. 1, support the grassroots. They have the answers. 2, work at scale to match the scale of the challenge. And 3, work to understand and address gender-based violence through gathering and using data and evidence, including the new frontiers, such as online. Thank you very much for having me as part of this panel, and wish you the best. Boa continuação. All the best for the rest of it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, for joining us. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos y con ella
Thank you,
cerramos.
Alicia, for joining us. With this, we conclude this event. Thank you to those of you who participated in Zoom and YouTube. My name is Jessica Belmont. I'm a communicator from the World Bank. This was an event to invest to prevent violence against women and girls. And you know, the hashtag continue the conversation. Number 16 days, there no excuse. Goodbye, and thank you for joining us.